Welcome to Ask Sean, where I explore all sorts of questions about life, relationships, and being human. I'm Sean Slevin, a licensed professional counselor and a licensed marriage and family therapist. And if you have a question for me, you can submit that anonymously at asksean.org. So in this video, I'm obviously not at my desk. I'm sitting on the couch that usually you see in the background, and that's because I'm getting to do an interview today with some JMU students, Alexa and Charlie, and we're going to be talking about sex, a topic that in a lot of ways our culture loves to talk about, but also can be very uncomfortable with. So yeah, we'll see where we go. This might be one really long meandery video, or I might cut this into several smaller videos for the YouTube channel. But glad you, the viewer, are here, and yeah, let's begin. Maybe I'll say a little bit about the question that y'all had of should a couple talk about prior sexual experiences prior to having sex? And I'm honestly not sure. I guess I feel like it depends. And I'm curious to see kind of where I go with this, because I'm mulling it over. I guess some of the cautions I would offer is I think we want to be careful about seeking tons of detail, or I think we want to be asking, why do I want to know detail? It reminds me a little bit actually of like when I work with couples where there's been an affair. One of the things I talk with them about, and with the partner who is the one who's been cheated on, is just really exploring with them like what do you actually need to know, and what are you seeking to know as a way of trying to somehow like feel control or stability, because the thing we want to be careful about is like we can ask for detail that ends up haunting us. Like we don't need to know all things. Having said that, there's a place for having discussion about one's partner's sexual history, and I guess what I want to offer is that instead of coming in that first and foremost as like, okay, I want to know like exactly how many partners and what kinds of da da da, and was it hookups, was it long-term relationship, da da da. Instead of like immediately going to those like kind of, I don't know, mechanistic details, to instead be thinking first about, well, how do I feel about how I have handled my sexual energies and how I have played that out in my own relationships? And can I start actually, instead of asking questions, can I start with sharing? Can I say, hey, I would like to talk some about, kind of our sexual histories. I'd like to hear about yours and about mine. And really I want to talk some about how we relate to sex and our sexual energies, which I realize even all that's going to be super awkward. Like, I swim in these waters all the time, so I'm comfortable with like really vulnerable stuff. But, the average person is going to be like, oh, holy shit, how am I going to like... So I want to acknowledge that, but I'll start with kind of like what we could aspire to, and then maybe perhaps we'll see if I have a thought or two on like, what might be smaller bites. But I do think this principle about can I take the risk of sharing first as opposed to asking, because it's super vulnerable. It's really freaking vulnerable. And it's easy to have shame, whether we've done anything wrong or not, or in terms of our what our own ethics and morals are. It's just so intimate, it's easy to have shame come up, because shame isn't really about whether we've done anything wrong. It just jumps on us about, any places it can. So yeah, to come to one's partner and say, well, so here's some of how I've kind of engaged with sex. Like maybe it's been something I've treated kind of lightly, and like I would like to move towards sex sooner or later, or maybe it's something that for me it's like it's a really special sacred thing. And so as we're getting to know each other more, as we're like kissing and being more intimate, like I just want to kind of talk some about, like, even though my body might want to go further, like I want to try to like stay within certain limits, and can we talk about that? Also, I can share a little bit about my history. I'm not sure I want to go into a ton of detail about super specifics, but I can, if you're wondering how many partners I've had or whatever. But we're really trying to, I guess what I'm suggesting here is to do the hard work, of like, well, what am I really wanting to know from the other person, and am I willing to share that? Am I willing to start with being vulnerable? Which the hard thing is, the other person may not be ready to be vulnerable back. You know, they might be like, well, just hearing all of that from you was a lot, and I need to sit with that for a few days before I could share about myself. And then it's like, oh, okay, well, that's, that's hard, um, but here's why this, I mean, I guess where this is really useful is that this is, these are emotional muscles that are so relevant to actually engaging in sex. Like if we're going to engage in sex in a healthy way, we don't want to be using it to avoid. We don't want to be using it to numb, or to try to feel secure when we don't, in the relationship or something like that. Like we want it to be this outflow of the growing intimacy that's happening between us and our partner. And so it's like, well, if I can't navigate this vulnerable conversation about here's some of my, for lack of a better way of putting it, philosophy of sex, or theology of sex, if I'm coming from like a religious, spiritual context, if I don't have the emotional muscles to be vulnerable about that, then like, well, I should probably be really damn cautious about taking my clothes off.
Yeah.
I mean, like, and I don't say that with any meanness towards anyone. I just mean it just if I can't do the one, then I'm probably not ready to do the other.
Mm-hmm.
Like because these are degrees of vulnerability and intimacy, right? Now the reality is, it can, in one sense, feel easier to take our clothes off and to engage in sex than to have that emotional interaction. And yet, what we are really longing for in a sexual experience requires the hard emotional work.
Mm-hmm.
Because what we really want, and what I think sex is meant to be, is it's meant to be in the foundation, in the container of we've already been practicing being vulnerable. Like um, we've been revealing things about ourselves, to be a little playful here in my language, maybe, to one another progressively, and not all at once, not on the first date, not on the third date. I mean, everybody's different in terms of their progression, but I guess I want to encourage people to err on the side of waiting, just because it's these are powerful forces, and they have a way of like momentum builds, and it's just like, yeah, it's easy to get carried away, which like from an evolutionary standpoint, biological standpoint, helps the species stay existing, right? Like the propagation of the species. But we also are conscious beings, right? Like we're thinking creatures. And so we have a responsibility to like shepherd that, to not just like be like, oh, well, this is my impulse, so therefore I should totally do it. It's like, well, we have impulses for lots of things, like, like doesn't mean we should do all of them, right? Um, Yeah, so this then really does lead into kind of some of these questions about like how often should we talk about sex? Um, what are what's the cost of not talking about sex in a relationship? These kinds of things. And um, so with what we've been talking about here, we're establishing. I'm making the case that this is a very intimate act, that it's very powerful, that it's very bonding, that it's when done well, it is practicing and living into vulnerability as opposed to trying to avoid vulnerability. I think that's maybe in terms of a succinct takeaway is like being really mindful of, am I engaging sex from a place of trying to avoid vulnerability, or is this a way that I'm further practicing vulnerability? Um, and this is true regardless of like whether one has just started a relationship or you've been in a committed relationship for 50 years, because this is always, I think, this is always a temptation, because it's like because our bodies will respond physiologically, like there we humans are prone to, I think both males and females are prone to, we can force ourselves. um, and I think, though there's the stereotype of males not being as affected by that, I would disagree with that. I think men are often have been sort of trained to not to be less connected to themselves in certain ways. But yeah, like it. I guess I would wish for us as humans to, and what I would think, what I guess my view in terms of what's best is that we're in sync with ourselves, and then out of being in sync with ourselves, then there's an engagement with one another sexually in the context of a relationship. And so that we're in sync enough to like recognize if we're starting to get into a sexual interaction with our partner and to be like, I'm not all here, to like pause and be like, can we just hold each other, like I'm something's not right with me, um, and for that to be safe, and for the both parties to be able to hold space for that. And so then to be able to do that, right, well, we have to be practicing being vulnerable about this topic. We have to be practicing both in the context of sexual encounters with one another and outside of this context, before and after, talking about, hey, how are you feeling about, such and such, whether that's like, I had this thing I was thinking maybe we could play around with, or it's a checking in on, I guess really what I want to get is this checking in on one's heart, one's own heart and one's partner's heart. Um, like that's really kind of the more important thing. Like sex, like and sexual struggles, like they're not solved through techniques typically. There is some place for that in terms of sometimes there are like basic like fundamental like hey, we need to just talk about how bodies work and like certain things just aren't going to be comfortable and like so we need to talk about that. What's realistic to expect. So there are sort of like some basic kind of technique things, but beyond that, beyond sort of that, and there's no shame in needing assistance on that because it's like it's intimate, vulnerable stuff, and it's hard to talk about. So but beyond that, it's really much more about like what's going on in our hearts, like how are we doing emotionally, are we connected to ourselves, are we connected to one another. Um, Yeah, because again, like it's tempting to use sex as a shortcut at whatever stage of a relationship, whether we've been together 50 years or, just the past few months or past year or 2 years or whatever. Um, so yeah, I think there's no magic number of like, okay, we should talk about sex once a week or twice a week or whatever. It's really more just, are we pressing into being vulnerable? Are we pressing into talking about stuff that we sense like, I want to talk about this, but I'm really scared? And that can be a great way to start a conversation. Hey, there's something I want to talk to you about, but I'm really scared. And a lot of times it's helpful to add, and I'm not scared because it has anything to do with you. It's just scary for me. I'm having this feeling. I'm not trying to say you are a scary person, right? Like, um, this is vulnerable for me. Um, so I'm going to try to wade into it. And then, pause and be like, how are you doing as I'm sharing? Like, is this vulnerable for me? Is this vulnerable for you? And like, can we start to talk about that this is vulnerable together? Can we be in that vulnerability together? Because so much about good lovemaking, helpful, nourishing, sustaining, bonding lovemaking is about, it's really about connection. How are we connecting? Um, it doesn't mean connection has to be perfect, but are we being vulnerable with each other? And it's in that vulnerability then that is what then makes the removal of clothing and the joining of bodies sort of feel like a natural progression. As opposed to like, okay, well, we kind of got to do this because we haven't in however long, and da da da. It's like that's a terrible reason. Like, don't do it because of some arbitrary timetable. Like, um, like that's a distortion. Like I think that's a distortion. Like really really be letting sex be an outflow of connection. And so that means we have to be having conversations along the way about how are we connecting, how are we doing. Some conversations that maybe ultimately are related to sex, we might not talk about sex at all because we're just talking about like, hey, I know that like work has been really stressful. Like, how are you doing with that? Like, or I know like we had a bit of a fight yesterday, and I want to apologize for my part. I would love to hear how you're doing. Like, yeah, it's like that's those aren't explicitly conversations about sex, but like uh, they're not irrelevant to sex, right? Like, because how we navigate those is going to impact then, how well can we talk about sex? How well can we actually engage in sex? Um, and so, yeah, to the degree to which we're not able to talk about sex, that's a warning sign because um, that's saying, okay, here, and I guess particularly I want to say particularly, the more that we're in a relationship where we have been engaging with each other sexually. But this also, I mean, this relates to a relationship that's prior to that to a degree, um, depending on what sort of the agreed upon boundaries are in terms of what we are and aren't going to engage in together, like what are our philosophies, theologies of sex, and are respecting each other in that and so there may be like a hey, let's not talk too much about sex at this stage because that's just gonna like rev us up, right? So there's something to be said for that, but even there, are we practicing vulnerability with each other, and a level of vulnerability that is appropriate to corresponding to the level of relationship we are trying to deepen into. um, so yeah, and kind of thoughts, reflections on any of that.
No, I completely agree with the whole like being vulnerable and like if you're not vulnerable enough to talk about it, then how is it going to be when you actually go to do it? You know,
Right, right,
I completely agree with that. That I feel like is one of the most important parts of talking about sex is like you have to understand that like I have to be vulnerable and like let my emotions out talking about it, not just
right,
doing it. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think that's hit most of your questions.
Yeah, I feel like you hit upon like everything that like we were asking for too.
Cool.
Yeah, no, it was
Good,
like,
good.
and they all like kind of like flowed together, like especially like when it goes from like talking about it to seeing like what the cost is not talking about it. I agree, it is like it's a
Yeah.
warning, like it's kind
Right.
of it's like what people say like a red flag, like
Right. 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 The invitation there is to reflect on where else are we not being vulnerable with each other.
yeah,
Right. And if I think the thing there is if we are being vulnerable with each other in other areas, that's good. Then it's like okay, so there's something about this area that it's particularly sensitive, which is not surprising. And so then how can we venture into that? How can we each try to be brave and kind of move towards that little by little? Um, and if the not being able to talk about sex at all or very little, if that is also like yeah across the board we're not very vulnerable with each other, it's like well that's a huge thing.
yeah,
Like and so then the question for the individual is what are the ways in which I don't do well at being vulnerable? It's easy to blame one's partner, like, well, but if they were being more vulnerable to me, well, I can't change that.
yeah,
Where do I get stuck? Where do I hold back?
yeah. Gotta
You
recognize
know,
like yourself, your own
right? And
boundaries.
what do I need to work on so that I can take risks, whether the other person meets me in those or not?
Mm-hmm.
Like, because it's like, I guess because this is a posture towards life. I want to be living my life in a way where I am taking risks and being vulnerable. I'm expanding into the world, um, and yeah, and so it's like if I'm not doing that and I'm pinning that on well because my partner or this person or whatever is XYZ, it's like well it's not irrelevant whatever we're experiencing from them, but ultimately I'm responsible for me.
Yeah,
And so um, yeah, what does it look like for me to press into vulnerability, which doesn't mean not having boundaries. It doesn't mean like we're not gauging like what does it feel like can actually be met here, but we just want to be sure we're practicing being vulnerable as opposed to avoiding. That's kind of the distinction. So there's a difference between I'm out of wisdom. I'm like, yeah, it doesn't seem like we can go here, and I'm going to name that. I want to go some places it doesn't seem like we can go, and that's kind of really important to me. That's where I'm still being vulnerable. Even as I'm naming the places that I'm not yet going to go because I'm not experiencing that we can do that well together. Versus I'm just not talking about it at all and I'm totally avoiding, right? So I think those can be important distinctions. Um, but yeah, well, great being with you.
yeah. You too. Thank you so much for coming, interviewing, and having
Yeah.
such great responses to our questions and giving us so
Yeah.
much information. This is going to be so helpful.